All right, well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to be here for our fourth and final session, our Standing Side by Side Parent Sex Education Series. My name is Leslie Massicott, and we're gonna be doing introductions here in just a second, but our topic for tonight is LGBTQ plus identities and homophobic bullying. And so on the next slide, we actually have two folks joining us tonight. So you maybe recognize Montserrat from last time. So I'll go ahead and let Montserrat introduce herself. Maybe. Jenna, do you want to introduce yourself maybe while we're...
Yeah, now that you were spoiled for the whole presentation. That's
Sneak
okay.
peek.
I'm Jenna. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the prevention educator at Orange County Rape Crisis Center. Good to be with y'all.
Yeah, we're so excited to have Jenna join us today in facilitating. So Monse, now you can take it away.
I usually use the hold space bar function to unmute myself so I don't have to struggle with a button. And now I see what happens when you do that when you're sharing your screen. But hello, everyone. My name is Montserrat. I am the Teens Climb High program assistant, and I'm so excited to be here for my second presentation with you all.
Yeah, and as I said, my name is Leslie Massicott. I use she, they pronouns. I work with Monse at the Compass Center, which is a domestic violence agency in Orange County. So we're going to do a little icebreaker to start off the session. And so I'd love to hear from folks in the chat, who was the first queer or gay person that you saw in the media?
I've been waiting to share my answer.
Oh, Jenna knows. Yes, put that in the chat, Jenna. Yeah, so who, for others, like who was the first queer or gay person you saw in the media? This might be very different depending on how old we are, right? For me, when I was thinking of this icebreaker, it was taking me a while to think of somebody. And then I was like, oh, remember the Reading Rainbow guy? I don't remember his full name, but I was like, oh, I didn't know at the time that he was gay.
LeVar Burton.
Yes, LeVar Burton, but he is. So that's the first one that came to mind. So who else do we have in here? Sandra Bernhard, yeah, Madonna, George Michael, Rosie O'Donnell, and Jack and Will. Oh, from
Will and Grace.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. What about others? Can you remember? It's kind of hard to remember sometimes, but. Or if you can't remember anybody, share that too. I mean, I think that's helpful to know as well. Indigo Girls, Ellen DeGeneres. We thought it was going to be flooded with Ellen, honestly. So, what about others? Can you think of any? If maybe there weren't any. George Michael too. Yeah. Thanks, y'all. Rock Hudson. Okay. Boy George.
Man, Boy George, that's a good one.
Yeah, we'll definitely keep those coming. I think it's interesting to think about what was our first introduction to LGBTQ identities in the media, right? How were they represented? How were these introduced to us? So I find that we thought it would be an interesting way to start this, to see what are our first impressions, right? And so I'll go over our agenda for today. We're in the introduction currently. And then Jenna is going to explore do a section on what is gender. So really unpacking what gender is. Monte is going to lead us in a discussion about how support and supporting LGBTQ students and young people has changed over time, and allow some personal reflection from you all to kind of see what are some of the ways that things have changed over time. And then I will be leading the section on sharing some tips for supporting LGBTQ plus kids and youth. And then we wanted to make sure that we give space at the end to address any types of questions that you all might have, related to your own families, related to, challenges that you have faced, or anything else that you want to kind of discuss or ask from us. We'll leave some time at the end for that. So throughout this, if you do have questions particularly about wanting to receive additional support or having any questions that might come up, we definitely encourage you to jot it down somewhere, and we will save it until the end to address it. Awesome. And then we're going to conclude and provide you with some additional resources, and that will be our session. So I think I will turn it at this point over to Jenna.
Awesome, y'all. So glad you all are here with us tonight. So first off, we're going to talk a little bit about what gender is and how gender is also different from sexual orientation. So in this first slide here, I have included this really funny comic about, what a non-binary person might experience when they're picking their gender, right? So you can choose between these two gender hats and then the pink blob, which I am a huge fan of, picks the special rainbow wibbly wobbly gendery wendery hat, which I think is just so great. And before we keep going to just fully define what gender is, I want to note that I'll be referring a lot to the Trevor Project's 2020 National Youth Survey of LGBT youth across the United States. So youth in this survey are ages between 13 and 24, and they were able to survey 40,000 different individuals. And that's the largest survey of LGBT youth ever conducted. And so now we're thinking about gender, the youth in this survey identified with about 100 different combinations of terms to describe their gender identity. And I want to bring that up because I know that thinking about gender and also sexuality can be so overwhelming because there are so many different kinds. But just knowing that there are more than just 2 or 4 or however many acronym, how many letters are in the LGBTQ acronym, there's so much more, and keeping that open mind really help us understand and support youth who are identifying in ways that are not either heterosexual or cisgender. So we'll get more into that a little bit. You can go to the next slide. So when we think about gender, I'd like to first ask, what does society teach us about gender, right? What kind of information are we getting from movies, from books, from our families, from the people around us? And then what is the reality of gender, right? So when I say gender binary, that word binary is kind of meaning that there are 2 opposing sides of gender. There's this way and then the opposite side, right? And I want to also note that gender is separate from sexual orientation, right? So they do have a relationship with one another, but sexual orientation refers to who someone is attracted to, and then gender refers to how someone feels on the inside. So let's go to take a look at that next slide. So society teaches us that there are 2 genders. There's blue and pink, male and female, girl or boy. And something that a term that is often used is AFAB, or assigned female at birth, or a MAB, assigned male at birth, right? So you can imagine that when we say the word assigned, right? Because when a baby is born, the doctor looks at it, sees if it has a penis or a vagina, and says, this is a girl or this is a boy. And that's just written down on the birth certificate. And that is just how it's on your driver's license. It's on many different identifying documents that one has, right? So let's take a look at that next slide. The reality of gender is that it goes in all different directions. It's not just, North Pole, South Pole, left or right, male or female. There is a full spectrum, or I like to think of it as kind of like a mist or something that doesn't have a form or any shape at all. It can go in all directions. It's multidimensional. And there are so many different genders that people identify with. And how they feel on the inside. And it's important. I'm going to go, yes. Oh, that's fine. Go back one more. Yeah. So it's important to recognize the power of language, right? And so something that I really want to drive home today is that so many terms used to describe this marginalized group of folks who do not adhere to the gender binary or folks who are not straight, right? All of these, so many of these words were made by people who are not within this marginalized group, right? And sometimes the words are adopted by the marginalized group, but I want to express how important it is to use the words that the marginalized groups have come up and identified with so that, we are honoring and respecting their choices, right? And who they are. So I've defined a handful of commonly used terms here on this slide. Cisgender, meaning that someone identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth. And then we have transgender, describes those folks whose gender identity does not match the sex they were assigned at birth. Non-binary folks who you might hear of, which was also described that pink blob in that first comic, describes folks whose gender identity does not match up with those traditional male or female genders. And then something else that is in the zeitgeist is gender dysphoria, or that distress or anxiety that is caused by a trans person mismatch gender identity and assigned sex. So you can think of that kind of the bad feelings that are conflicting within a trans person's body when they, might see how they are they're treated by their friends, treated by their peers, their parents, the clothes that their parents buy them, the name that the people in their circle call them, and how that might conflict with who they feel like on the inside. Next slide, please, Monse. So this is an important aspect of the Trevor Project National Survey. Affirming gender identity is associated with lower rates of suicide amongst trans and non-binary youth. And, that I think that is just so important and also pretty scary, right? That respecting someone's identity, gender identity, and sexual orientation is literally life and death. So just thinking about how respect can be saving or impacting someone's life in such a huge way. Now, all of those negative feelings often come from homophobic bullying or folks that are not respecting their gender, right? So that could be peers or even parents, faith leaders, other family members in a queer youth's life. And all of those things can pile up along with, gender dysphoria and, general depression, right, to impact a youth so greatly that they begin thinking about taking their life. Next slide, Monse. So here are some interesting statistics regarding the correlation between respecting pronouns and attempts of suicide. So 1 in 5 trans and non-binary youth report that having had their pronouns respected by all or most of the people in their lives. So that's about 20% of the folks who were surveyed, right? And then less than 1 in 10 among those who primarily identify as non-binary. And we can practice a little bit later on about how to ask for someone's pronouns, how to share your own pronouns, and what to do when you mistake someone's pronouns. And this is another statistic that I really wanted to drive home, that it really is truly, respect is life and death. It could be life-saving. Next slide, Monse. So transgender and non-binary youth who report having their pronouns respected by all or most of the people in their life have attempted suicide at half the rate of those who did not have their pronouns respected. So all of those things, you can imagine bullying and also not having their identity acknowledged and affirmed, has an impact on a youth's quality of life, right? So you can see that the folks who have had their pronouns respected and used just attempted suicide at half the rate. Now that is just like an incredible statistic, I think. But I do, and I understand, that this is like very heavy and very serious, but I also want to impress upon you the seriousness of, the violence and oppression that trans and queer youth experience and what that impact can have on their life. Next slide, Monse. So right now, I'm sure that your mind is reeling with all of this information. So I'm going to give you some tools to keep in your back pocket, because information, while is widely available, there are, like I said, it's important to use the language to talk about these things respectfully, and so that you can affirm the queer and trans youth in your life. So I'm going to have include a list of words that are commonly used that might be outdated or offensive. So instead of referring to trans people as transvestites, trannies, transgendered, notice that ED, or transsexual, use trans or just transgender. Transsexual and transvestite and tranny are not only offensive, but transvestite and tranny are more offensive, but transsexual is in particular a more outdated term. Next one, Monse. Instead of using hermaphrodite to describe someone, we use the word intersex. And intersex means someone who was born with similar genitals of someone who has or both sex organs, like it could be either internal or external, an individual. Instead of saying pre or post-operative or pre or post-op, don't focus on a trans person's desire for surgery. It's an invasion of privacy. And I understand that it's often a question of, oh, have you gotten the surgery yet? Well, in many ways, gender affirming surgery, as you can see on the next row there, is a choice for different individuals to make. Right. So there are many ways to affirm someone's gender without medical intervention. And so some trans folks may or may not decide to have medical intervention. And which is why I said, instead of saying sex change surgery or capital T, capital S, the surgery, you can think of it as gender affirmation surgery, or getting medical intervention that affirms the gender that they know that they are. Are there any questions about anything that I shared? There's a brief few minutes that I have for my section. Let's see what the chat was saying. Thanks, Rebecca. All right, well, I can hand it over to Monse, who's going to give us a chance to discuss a little bit.
Sounds good. So we're going to have a moment, just have a short discussion and kind of reflect on what our experiences are, what we have lived through. So LGBTQ identities aren't new. So this conversation is something that's always been around. But I'm curious to hear from you all about how it's changed. So first, I want to ask you all, how often were LGBTQ plus identities presented in media when you guys were young? How often was it spoken about? Maybe what was spoken about them? And feel free to come off mute or put in the chat.
This is Rebecca. I'm an older parent. I'm in my mid-40s. And honestly, if it was presented, it was in a very typically offensive way, definitely not a positive way. And I would say almost never.
Right, yeah. So this negative stereotype might be continuously presented. I see in the chat so little and only as the character for people to laugh at, right? So kind of just very rarely presented in a way that is positive or that is helpful or representative of actual people with different identities, more so as kind of like the comedy jab that people are putting in. Almost never I'm seeing in the chat, right? So very limited representation, very little conversation in the media as well. Right, you never knew that different people were LGBT, part of the LGBTQ plus community, and they came out later when they were older. This kind of like repressing identities just because of how little it is presented in the media as well. So now I want to see, gay or lesbians were only terms used, right? So there wasn't a whole lot of different identities that were spoken about. It was, you know, the way that we think of gender, that was just male, female, and now different sexual orientations, just gay, straight, or yeah, gay or straight. Then now there's a whole wide range of different sexual orientations that we speak about, not because they are necessarily new, just because the conversation has opened up more recently. And now I want to ask, which identities were widely known and understood? So we kind of get some of that in the chat. Gay or straight identities, mostly within what would be male and male or female and female. Is there anything else that we think was known about? Any different identities that we heard? Yeah, so I'm seeing these offensive terms that we used to internalize and use more often. So transvestite, which we have mentioned as an offensive term and to refer to transgender folks. But yeah, cross-dressers, lesbo, queer. So there was all of these kind of these different terms to relate to these communities that were oftentimes negative and used in a negative way. So calling people lipstick lesbians in the 90s, right? So kind of putting them in a box and trying to repress their identity in a way that they never asked for. And it is not representative of the community entirely. All right, so keep these going. I'm going to pull up some more questions for us. How did you talk about identities when you were growing up, whether this be within your friend groups, within your family system? How were you all talking about identity growing up? This can be either gender identity or sexual orientation as well. All right, so Rebecca says, we didn't talk about it unless it was about a relative who was weird. And we just didn't talk about in polite company, right? So kind of repressing it and only talking about them as the others. So really separating them and trying to make it feel a lot more stigmatizing, right? About having a different identity or different sexual orientation. It was something that was not discussed, right? So we didn't really openly talk about it. If we did talk about it, I see it's only binary. We only spoke about male, female. There was not a conversation about different gender identities open publicly, or people weren't comfortable speaking about it openly. Oriented about fitting into a group, right? So this idea of having a label onto your identity, you have to fit somewhere, you have to fit into a group, and otherwise you are completely left out of the conversation, not discussed, right? So a lot of assumptions were made about different identities, right? So we didn't openly talk about it. There's not a back and forth conversation. There's just, this is what the assumptions that we've seen in the media, whether it be from movies, radio stations, different shows, playing for the other team, right? So they were gay or lesbian. not really opening the conversation for different identities. We all know that there are now different sexual orientations as well. You know, pansexuals. We have a whole wide range of different sexual orientations, and there is the idea of putting sexual orientation also in this binary of either you're straight or you're gay, and once you are gay, you are part of the LGBTQ community, or back in the past thought of as the others, or the less valid. So now I want to transition over to asking you all, how has supporting a queer child changed over time? Whether what you saw growing up, or maybe from how you saw different children being raised in this climate. And also thinking about how raising a queer child is changing now, right? How is it developing now? Right, there's more interest in gender expansive parenting, so there's a lot more active parents. There's, you know, we have you all here today at this presentation, so trying to learn more about identities, trying to learn how to support your children. It's much more acceptable now, right? So we keep talking about it. We are changing our representation in our media, having things accurately presenting resources to communities. So instead of having one coming out conversation, gender and sexuality are dinner table conversations, right? This is a big thing, you know, the whole coming out thing where there's not a heterosexual coming out as heterosexual. There's never, you know, a question of whether or not the child is heterosexual is kind of assumed. And so instead now it's more of a dinner conversation, right? We can talk about it over dinner and not make it such a big thing. All right, so it's easier with parents and harder with most grandparents, right? Who are in older generations, who might still have a lot of this internalized idea about identities. Yeah, so I'm seeing in the chat, there's a lot more acceptance being spread for who they are. There's not as much stigma for their gender identities, their sexual orientation. Less shame for our children, right? So as long as there is this open conversation that we're having, there is no shame attached to it. We are supporting our children. We're supporting, you know, adults even into creating this environment where they feel valid, where they feel accepted and not stigmatized as in older generations may have been, and represented also in the media is very important as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Leslie now.
Oh, you have a couple more comments in the chat, actually, Monse, before we dive into the next section. So Rebecca was saying that the growth I saw in my kid during virtual learning was amazing. Yeah, the distance made coming out easier somehow, completely unexpected bonus. Yeah, a lot of people I feel like are talking about online learning as being like the worst thing that ever happened. And that's true for some folks. And also there have been some benefits, right? Some benefits.
Yeah, that distance I feel like helps just being more comfortable, feeling like, you know, you're not always in this eyeball lens. So very interesting to see that as well. There's going to be a huge impact on our children as far as remote learning goes. And it is easier to find representation in the media as well online, whether that be from influencers, from movies, Netflix, right? Some introspection, right? So taking time to themselves, kind of learning more about themselves, feeling comfortable in their bodies. You know, there's not just going to school and always also having this herd mentality. Once you're in school and with your different classmates, it can be a little bit difficult to kind of separate yourself from that. So that's very interesting to hear. And thank you guys for all sharing.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I like to talk about how we did sex ed online and how it actually allowed the youth to like open up in ways that they didn't in person because of, you know, some of the things that you're sharing in the chat. I think there's just there's been opportunity for some introspection, some separation from the mob mentality kind of, you know, that happens at school. So it has been interesting. But I know it's also been very harmful and damaging for other folks who have to be at home stuck with parents who weren't supportive. So I mean, it's kind of, yeah, it's good for some and really, really dangerous for others. So but anyway, so thank you all for sharing. I think this was really interesting. And I'm going to be speaking specifically about offering some tips for supporting LGBTQ young people in your life. Specifically through the lens, or like with the framework of understanding that a very large percentage of LGBTQ students do experience harassment or assault at school. And Jenna kind of spoke to this earlier. But because school is not considered a safe place for a lot of LGBTQ young people, I wanted to think about how can we really address that as parents, you know, both at home and also addressing this reality for young people, young queer people at school. And so a lot of the tips and ideas that I included in this section of the presentation actually came from a research study from Shift NC, which is one of our leading sex ed organizations in the state. And they actually conducted a study that asked LGBTQ students, particularly BIPOC ones, so Black and Indigenous people of color, for their recommendations for how to make schools more inclusive for LGBTQ folks. So a lot of the suggestions that I offer are drawing directly from these queer youth. And so the suggestions and the tips that I'm going to offer are going to start small, and they're going to go big. So what are some small concrete ways that we can think about addressing this and offering support at home, and then moving to bigger ways of support. So for some tips starting at home, the very first thing I think that I can offer is just really starting early. The absolute importance of starting early to just examine our how we dress our children, how we treat our children based on gender, reconsidering gender reveal parties and the impact that can have on children who don't identify in terms of the binary. Because I really think a lot of these mindsets start very, very early, right? And so often it's related to unconscious bias of just, this is the way that we've always treated girls, for example. And this is how we're going to continue doing it if we don't really pause and question what that looks like. Like, for example, I babysat a while ago the two twins. One was a boy, one was a girl, and they were 1.5 years old, so very young. But I played with them all day. And what I noticed when I was playing with them was that the boy was already being very aggressive, and he was taking all the toys from his sister always. And, would get really, really upset if she had a toy that, that he wanted and he didn't get it. But the girl had just gotten used to getting toys taken from her. And so was just kind of used to being the more submissive one, the one that was taking the toy from it, having the toy taken away from her. And so, it could be behavioral, it could be other things, but of course my sex educator brain was like, oh my goodness, look at the gender roles already that are falling into the expectations that we have that are starting already. These kids are only 1.5 years old. And so how have we potentially encouraged that kind of behavior and fitting into the gender binary in ways that are potentially harmful, right? So really thinking, doing personal reflection and being really intentional about gender, the way we think about gender with our kids young. There is a book, actually, if you want to click again, Monse, there's a book that I can recommend called Raising Them, which is, it's Our Adventure in Gender Creative Parenting, which kind of explores this a little bit more, this idea of how to really look at gender from an early age and try to create spaces for more creativity and flexibility with young people. So I think if you click again, Monse, it will go away so I can do the rest. But I also wanted to speak to speak on this idea of respecting pronouns and names. And so I think, as Jenna said in the last section, this is so important to really be able to validate somebody's identity, is to use the names that they are choosing to go by and using the pronouns that they want to be referred, or they want to use for themselves. And so ways that we can do this and normalize this is using pronouns in our own introductions. Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie. My pronouns are she, they. Right? That's a really easy way to just already kind of incorporate that into our language and allow a space of safety for someone to then to share theirs potentially too, right? If you're not sure of somebody's pronouns, the easiest way is to just ask really politely. Sharing yours first is a great gesture of like, yeah, I'm not going to just expect you to give your pronouns. It's just a normal part of, I'm going to ask pronouns. Give my pronouns so that I can also ask for yours as well. And so I'm actually, on the next slide, we're going to show a little video with a person who describes, I think, a lot of really helpful tips about using pronouns. So we're going to take just a few minutes to watch this.
Hello, my name is Eli, and I use they, them pronouns. Today, I'm going to be talking about preferred gender pronouns, also called PGPs. While there has been a push towards asking, what are your preferred pronouns after meeting someone for the first time, I would also encourage to shorten that question to simply, what pronouns do you use? My chosen pronouns are not something I prefer, such as preferring chocolate to vanilla. Using them is not an option. Pronouns can give indicators of identity, but words in and of themselves, they're not feminine or masculine. This is why when someone asks for yours, avoiding saying feminine pronouns or masculine pronouns is important. Masc and fem describe how you express your gender presentation, certainly, but there are plenty of people who use she pronouns but look masc, and plenty of people who look fem but use they pronouns, and so on and so forth. There are as many genders as there are people in the world, so be sure to give and ask for a pronoun set, such as she, her, hers, or sie, here, hers, so that people know exactly which pronoun to use. Using someone's pronouns is not only respectable and validating, it's basic human decency. Using someone's pronouns correctly can be the difference between a good day or a bad dysphoria day, which is when someone may be feeling challenged with one or more gendered aspects of one's body, and which can manifest in different ways for different people. It's important for cis people to normalize asking for pronouns. List it in your bio, put it on your business cards, on your website. This way, it takes the onus off of trans people to self-identify and out themselves, and makes it a normal everyday occurrence. Using new pronouns takes practice, so here's a quick and easy way to practice pronouns when you encounter them. Their name is Chris, and they went to the store to buy themselves a new shirt. Her name is Miranda, and Z went to the store to buy herself a new shirt. Remember, all pronoun sets are valid. Also, this isn't comprehensive. I would encourage you to keep learning. Also keep in mind that you will mess up. Just apologize and keep moving. Let me know if you have any questions by commenting below.
Okay. So I feel like that video does a great job of just normalizing the use and giving kind of a little background on the different pronoun sets and things like that. And the piece of apologizing, I just want to draw out before I move on. If you're going to mess up, we all mess up, and that is totally okay. Just apologize, correct yourself, move on. Okay. So another suggestion, another tip that we want to offer is to provide lots of fun books, educational videos, and movies about LGBTQ plus experiences. And you can start doing this from a very early age. So I've got amaze.org on there that has tons of really fun videos. Julian as a Mermaid is just one of the many, many books out there that center an LGBTQ experience of a young child. I think actually, I'm not sure, but that's a really great book. Love Simon's one for older folks in high school. Sex Positive Families has a really good reading list. So if you're looking for additional books, they are a great website to check out as well. And you will get these slides afterwards. So these are going to be chock full of resources, so you don't have to be scrambling to write things down. But so that's another tip that we have. I wonder if others can in the chat can offer some other books, educational videos, movies about LGBTQ experiences that they have used or they have heard of that they feel is helpful. So what are some other resources? Some other, books, educational videos, movies. Oh, awesome. So Ultimate Comics in Durham has a great selection of transgender character comics, graphic novels, and very helpful staff. Amazing. That's really great to know. What about others? What are some other things that folks have used? Hoopla has a lot of digital comics. Jack Not Jackie. I haven't heard that one. Maybe is it a book? It's a book. Awesome. Yeah, so feel free to keep putting other resources out there. We want this to be kind of a resource share for y'all as well. Maybe there are others that, of course, there are others that we're not going to cover. And so we'd love to kind of use this as a gathering of some of those resources. So feel free to keep plopping some books, some movies in there as we keep going. But another tip to make sure that we're being supportive is being an askable parent. And what that means is, asking questions, not being judgmental, being curious with your kids, being a really good listener to your kids. And I think once you have presented yourself in a way that shows that you're not going to judge your kid for whatever they say or come to you with, then they're going to start coming to you with more questions and see you as a support person in their life. Surrounding your family, your young people with queer role models, regardless of whether they are queer or not, your child is queer or not. I think a lot of these tips are just general for anybody, right? And so we've got some, we already have some queer role model. I think somebody asked a question about good role models online for LGBTQ plus teens. Yeah, that's a great question, Missy. And Jenna offered someone on Instagram that's really great. But I wonder if others also have additional queer role models that they have in their life that they want to also put in the chat. I know for me growing up, it was really helpful to see folks, actually it relates to Rebecca's last point here of I had faith leaders who were around me who were openly gay, openly lesbian. And so having them around me growing up was very helpful. So feel free to put others, both online or personal ones, like whatever you find is helpful. So I couldn't, as a sexuality educator, I couldn't not include the next section, which is absolutely crucial in my opinion, is making sure that your LGBTQ plus student has access to queer-friendly sex education. And so what is pretty wild is that North Carolina's Healthy Youth Act of 2009, this is the policy that lays out the state sex education standards. It does not require teachers to talk about LGBTQ plus topics at school. So some of this sex education, probably a lot of it, is unfortunately going to have to be supplemented at home or outside of school. And so LGBTQ teens listed these topics on the slides as ones that they wanted to learn and they wanted sex ed to include. So how different body parts work for all different genders, how pregnancy prevention and STIs work for queer folks specifically, safer ways to have all kinds of sex, what healthy relationships looks like. And I cannot put enough importance on this last one, is making sure that you're connecting your queer student, your queer young person, to queer-friendly sexual health services. And so finding a health provider that's going to be supportive is really important. And so here's a resource that we have heard of before, where you can find a provider using the GLMA listserv, and this is the Health Professionals Advancing LGBTQ Equality. And so they've collected a lot of information of providers who are friendly, which is wonderful. I see there are also some additional resources in the chat, so keep those coming, folks. Okay, Monse, we can go to the next slide. And so here are some additional queer sex ed resources that I just wanted to provide. So these are places that you can point your young person if they do identify as LGBTQ or plus. Planned Parenthood has an amazing section. It's called All About Being LGBTQ, and there's tons of resources on that site related specifically to queer sex and queer safety and queer relationships. So that's a great one. Sexetc.org is very inclusive. They've got great resources as well. Scarlet Teen is another one. And these are more based on like kind of articles, which are really interesting as well. Youngmenshealthsite.org and youngwomenshealth.org are both queer-friendly sites related to sexual health. And if you just Google trans youth sexual health booklet, that's a really great resource for trans young people and addresses a ton of different sexual health concerns and questions specific to trans youth. So these are some great resources to check out. And then lastly, joining local support groups. I feel like there were some folks were putting information about support groups in the chat already, but these are some of the ones that we have heard of. So PFLAG PFLAG Triangle has got support groups for parents and guardians. The LGBTQ Center of Durham is definitely worth checking out. They have support groups both for, actually, I don't know if they have it for parents, but I know that they at least have it for youth, a space for queer youth to come together. Q Chat Space is one that I just learned about, which is like a virtual space for LGBTQ youth, and it's actually run by, moderated by an adult, like a trained adult, which is great. And then at our very own Compass Center, we have a support group for LGBTQ survivors of domestic violence, which is specific to adults, but something I wanted to offer as well. Oh, and it looks like at the LGBTQ Center of Durham, there is one for parents. Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. I wasn't sure. So those were some options for supporting your young person at home. At school, I just want to quickly go through some of these. So in encouraging to, or talking about how to call out homophobic slurs and stereotypes when you hear them is very important, right? So saying things like, Monty, if you want to show, click the slide again, saying things like, hey, that's not appropriate, or I don't actually think that's funny. And like practicing this at home is going to be helpful, because this calling out and calling in can be very difficult. And so really trying to practice that and encourage that at home can be a great step for trying to address it at school. Supporting your student or school in creating a gay-straight alliance is another thing you can do at school. So we do know from research that bullying and suicide rates decrease at schools with GSAs. So that is something that you could advocate for. I'd love to know in the chat too, of those who are represented, if your school does have a GSA. So which schools have them? Would love to hear in the chat. So put the name of your school if you know that it has a Gay Straight Alliance Club or some kind of LGBTQ club. I think that'd be helpful to know. Advocating for anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies that include orientation and gender. So a lot of times these policies include race, they include religion, they include all these things, but they don't include orientation and gender. And then following up with teachers and administrators if they're not enforcing policies, right? If your young person comes to you and said, this teacher didn't do something, I think that's helpful to ask your youth if they want you to be involved and help advocate for them. And then at home, you can support what they're learning at school by incorporating LGBTQ plus history and role models into what they're learning at school. So, asking what they're learning and trying to do some of your own research and adding some additional, queer history in there, I think is helpful as well. And then lastly, if you're really like, all of these things are great, but I want to do even more, you go for the state, right? Go for the state level and advocate for state policies that are more LGBTQ plus inclusive, because the reality is our policies are not always inclusive. And so I think though that if you are the parent of a queer youth, really involving them and seeing what ideas they have is crucial, because youth are our role models in advocating for change. And so seeing what ideas they have and letting them lead the way, I think is going to be really important, particularly when you start wanting to go on a bigger level and creating change there. So I think at this point we have time for some questions. And so I'll turn it back over to Jenna while I catch up in the chat because it looks like a lot has been happening. So I'll turn it over to you, Jenna.
Yeah, so feel free to put in the chat or come off of mute and answer any questions that you have, or ask any questions that you have. I'm going to see if there are any new questions in the chat that need to be lifted up.
Oh, I think there was a question about Power School, and I don't know if Roslyn or Carla, if either of you are on and know if you can address that about, like, I think how to change the name or pronouns or something on the Power School platform. I don't know if either of you know.
What was the question about Power School?
I think it was how can you change the name on Power School?
I don't know if you can actually change the name in Power School, because I think that the name has to be what's listed in the birth certificate. But there is a space in Power School that says what is the preferred name.
Right. This is Rebecca who was asking that, because my understanding was there was an ability to now change or add the preferred name and have that be what shows up in Google Meet, so that my kid is not constantly being outed by their old name.
Right. So I said you can put like the preferred name in there. And so I would say if it's not showing up as the preferred name, to contact the data manager at the school and let the data manager know that this is the preferred name that we want and that it should show up as the preferred name at all times.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, contact the school data manager. And the other thing, if in addition to that, Rebecca, is to contact the school, contact the principal and the assistant principal. But I definitely would contact the data manager first, because that's who puts the information into Power School.
So, because the school has been great about making sure everything is addressed to my child's name.
Yeah.
Not birth name, but
I would contact the data manager.
Meets is the problem.
I would contact the data manager at the school site.
Okay, we'll do.
And if that doesn't work, you can also touch base with the enrollment coordinator at Lincoln Center.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. The next person after that would be is it David? Who is it?
Catherine
Mao.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, contact Catherine
to help you.
Yeah,
I'll put it in the chat.
But contact your school's data manager.
All right, well, thank you for that. We appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I also volunteered to facilitate the question and answers section, is because I am open and willing to answer questions about my own personal experience growing up as a queer child. So if that is some of the questions that you would like answered, I am happy and open to answer that as well. Sure, Yvette. Thank you for asking. When I was thinking about doing this this presentation, I was thinking about, what I would want my parents to do different when I was younger. And as I was reflecting today, I was also thinking about all the things that they did okay. So one of the wonderful things that my parents allowed me to do was kind of just shop for clothes anywhere that I wanted to, no matter what age, which was really nice. And so I could choose even down to the underwear, what section that I wanted to go and shop in, which I really appreciate that. And just thinking about all of the wonderful resources that are out there now, I long for them so much. But definitely, I think one of the most important things that would have made a huge impact on my youth experience would have been having access to askable adults. Because I really wasn't able to have any conversations around gender or sexuality with until my peers were already asking their questions themselves, and that was usually around middle or high school, and that is where misinformation regarding all of those things runs rampant. But I wasn't able to kind of have those sort of nuanced conversations until I was late into high school with my peers, and I still struggle to this day having conversations about my gender identity with my parents. Struggle is generous. A generous word. But yeah, really what would have impacted my childhood was being around askable adults, askable parents.
Jenna,
Yes.
so when you say askable, could you tell me what you mean by that? Tell us what you mean by that. Like, what would have been comfortable as far as an askable adult, like a family friend? I can just only imagine like the hesitancy in the shyness of talking with an adult you don't know that well. So how'd that look, or what do you think would have made you comfortable?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I was close with I have a lot of uncles and aunts, so I was close with a lot of them. And even my parents too. So it all kind of really stemmed to like what my family was comfortable with discussing. So I never really had like a formal birds and bees talk. I was like given a book and that was that. And even when like sexy scenes or sex scenes would come up on TV or movies, there wouldn't be a discussion before or after. I would just have my eyes covered and then uncovered. Um, and so being around in that kind of environment, I didn't ever feel like it was appropriate for me to ever say out loud the things that I was feeling or questioning to any adults in my life. And I would really, and the folks, I mean, I trusted the adults to, keep me safe. But I certainly didn't feel comfortable discussing my gender or my sexuality. But something that would have really helped was just, beginning from, um, a young age is instead of saying, oh, Rosie O'Donnell is a lesbian, and I'm be like, what's that again? Oh, it's when a woman likes women. Okay. But and just saying, oh yeah, Ellen's one of those people too. There could have been more like a step after that instead of just naming all of these people who are not straight, right? There could have been a conversation or asking me how I felt, or you know um saying that gay people have regular lives and do regular things. um
Yeah,
and having the option of reading books or watching television or not having my eyes closed when there is a sexy scene, and then talking about how I felt when I watched after. Just being able to be comfortable just at the base level of talking about what sex is, I certainly think would have opened the doors to asking my adults for initiating conversation.
great. Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Well, I want to point out the time, and I do, yeah, I want to say, like, if folks need to head out and leave, I would say that's, please do so, and thank you so much for joining us. I know that there are a couple other questions in the chat. One about if Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools have anything equivalent to a safe zone training or any kind of signs or something like that, like they do at colleges. I think that's a great question. And so I would definitely encourage you all, if you want to stay and we can keep asking some questions, please do. Also, we'll be sending out an email here within the next day or so with a feedback form for your feedback of this session and the series as a whole. But we're so glad that you all were able to join us. And I will go ahead and try to answer that, see if anybody can answer that question about the safe zone training. But otherwise, have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, there's also one more slide after this. Just there were some more resources. I could
That's
not
right.
recommend enough the documentary on Netflix, Disclosure. Just so wonderful about trans representation in film. And really made by trans people, from who were interviewed to behind the camera to direction. Every aspect, every level of this movie was made by trans people. So could not recommend higher.
And I wonder if Carla or Rosalind, would either of you, if you're still on, I think you both are, would you be able to speak to the safe zone training or any signs, if you know of any initiative happening at the district level about that?
I know that some of the teachers have participated in like the safe zone training. I don't know if they are, I don't think the district actually offers any itself. And I know that the signs are in some of the schools, some of the middle and high schools. Most of the, to my knowledge, most of the middle and high schools do have GSAs. And the best way the students could probably find out about them is to check with their social workers or the guidance counselors at their school sites to find out about them. But I don't know if, I don't know of any other schools that's actively doing safe zone trainings.
And that may be something we can take back to Dr. Bank and Ms. Carey. And so we can talk with them about that. And then maybe they may want to offer next year.
I love that. Thank you so much for offering that, Rebecca, and for Rosalind and Carla for being able to respond. Any other final thoughts or questions before we sign off? All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Really glad that you all were able to join us, and hopefully we will see you next year with some more sessions. So here's our contact information if you need anything from us. Thanks, y'all.